Rebecca and I are here today from the IRM's Charities Special Interest Group to discuss risk treatment, monitoring and review, the third in our series of presentations to accompany our Getting Started campaign. So without further ado, let's get started. We'll start by clarifying what we mean by risk treatment. Once you've identified the risks your objectives face, analysed them and evaluated them to decide how important they are, it's time to think about how you're going to treat them. In other words, what you're going to do about them. You need to think whether there is anything you could do to reduce the likelihood of the risk occurring and anything that might reduce its impact on your objectives if it did happen. And we'll look at how you might go about this in a moment.
And there's just one thing I'd like to add here, and that's to say that just being aware of risks is not enough to make them go away. You will need to think carefully about whether you need to take any action, and indeed whether it's even possible to take action. Sometimes there'll be things that are outside your control, for example the state of the economy. But although you might not be able to do anything about that, you can think about what you would do if there was another downturn, so that the impact on your objectives is kept to a minimum.
In our guides, we've suggested you think about the 4 T's. It's a useful way of thinking about the different ways you might want to handle your risks. So what do the 4 T's stand for, Rebecca?
Well, it's quite simple and hopefully quite memorable too. It's treat, tolerate, terminate and transfer. But let me explain what this means in a bit more detail, and we'll start with treat. Now, we've used treatment as the overall term for this part of the risk management process, but here we really do mean taking some action to make the risk better. We're going to operate on the risk if you like, and you'll probably want to treat most risks, but do think carefully before you leap into action. So, for example, you might be worried that your fundraised income won't grow by the levels you need to do the work you've planned. Now, this might be because your charity has a low profile, or it could be that your fundraisers just aren't very good, and you'd need to do something very different to address the risk in each of those cases.
So what you're saying then, Rebecca, is that we need to think about what would cause the risk to occur before we start to decide how to treat it.
That's right, and you also need to think about the specific impact on your objectives too. So if high staff turnover is a cause of you not having the capacity or skills you need for some planned work, a way of reducing the impact that has is to have succession plans in place so there's always someone to step in if someone leaves.
And of course a contingency plan is essential for the most severe risks. Knowing what you're going to do if the worst happens will save you an awful lot of time running around like a headless chicken.
So let's move on to tolerate. Now this will usually be where you've identified a risk where both the likelihood and impact scores are quite low, and you're prepared to accept or tolerate that level of risk, so you decide to do nothing. Remember, you really don't have to throw the kitchen sink at every risk. Use your resources wisely and focus on the most important risks. But just because you've decided no action is needed now, remember to review the risk regularly, as it could change and you might decide that action is needed after all. So an example might be where you're working on a new project where in the early stages there's quite a lot of uncertainty. You might not know quite how service users are going to react to the project, and you might assume that they'll love it, so you decide against action. But then a chance meeting with some service users suggests that actually you'll need a major communications campaign to win them round.
And terminate, I suppose, is the opposite of tolerate. This is where the level of risk you've identified is so high that you just have to stop whatever it is that's creating the risk. So this might be where the risk of harm to service users or staff or volunteers is so high that you just can't live with it. But it might not always be so dramatic. You might want some new technology, but if you discover the only options are largely untested or prone to crashing, then you might decide to stop and wait until there's something better on the market. Alternatively, you may want to organise an event, but if you organise it in an area that's prone to flooding and waterlogging, you may not want to hold it in months when there are high rainfall. And finally, let's look at transfer. This might not be an option for many risks, but sometimes you will be able to insure against a risk or use contracts to transfer the risk to a third party. So for example, if you're holding a gala fundraising dinner at the Hilton Park Lane, you will want to be sure that the hotel takes on the risks for their negligence. This is usually detailed in the venue contract and will remove a great deal of risk from you for the event in a perfectly legitimate manner. Alternatively, you might take every step to protect your employees against back problems incurred as part of their job, but if they're working with people who require lifting, you may well find problems do occur and allegations are made. An insurance contract can help by providing a team of claims professionals who can request and check medical evidence and ultimately, if you have a legal liability, to compensate as the employer.
And just one more point here, don't forget to record your planned action on your risk register so you've got a record of what's been decided. And just one word of caution before we move on. It's quite astonishing the number of times I've come across teams who've spent time identifying their risks, deciding what to do about them, but then they file the risk register away and don't bother doing anything. If you sit back and do nothing when that actually wasn't the plan, you might be lucky, the risks might not occur. But if they do, then you might find yourself doing this.
Now let's look at monitoring risks. This too is something that can be overlooked, but it's a vital part of the risk management process because risks change and new risks emerge.
And you'll need to monitor and review your risks regularly, and we don't just mean once a year. Depending on the nature of your work, risks can change very quickly, so think about that and plan dates for your reviews so they're not forgotten about.
And it's also useful to put in place an escalation process, so as new risks or risks change, and as that's identified, action can be taken quickly. So what should you look at when you're conducting your risk review? We touched on it when we were talking about tolerating risks, but risks do change. Sometimes your improved knowledge of a situation means a risk appears more or less important. Or it could be that internal changes such as a new strategy or a new CEO or external changes will impact on the risk. Look at each of your risks and consider whether there have been any such changes that might need you to re-evaluate the risk score.
And as we've said, over time new risks may emerge. Don't just assume that the risks you thought of when you started your new strategy or project last year will be the only ones you face during its lifetime. Now, if you're in a meeting to discuss the progress of a piece of work, it's a good idea to wrap up that meeting by thinking about whether discussions have highlighted any new risks that should be added to your risk register.
And look at the action that's been taken to treat risks. Remember, you're taking that action to either reduce the likelihood of the risk occurring or reduce the impact if it does. So as that action takes effect, you would expect to see the likelihood score coming down. And if you're confident that action taken will reduce the impact of the risk should it occur, then you'd expect to see that score coming down too. But what if it isn't?
Well, then it's definitely time to take stock. Don't just blithely carry on with what you're doing if it's not having the effect you expected. Stop it, or maybe do more of it, or less of it, or maybe you should just try something else. Now, some of the projects I've worked with in the past have decided to mount a major communications programme to address the risk of people not being bought into the proposals, and yet the risk score never changed. If that sort of thing happens to you, you really need to ask yourself whether the communications are effective. Why waste time and money doing something that isn't working? And once you've completed your risk review, remember to update the risk register.
And our final point on this is make sure you learn from any lessons. There may well be issues that would apply in the future for some pieces of work, so it's important to take on lessons learned. It goes back to Rebecca's example of the communication strategy, and an easy way to do this is to ask yourself and the team 2 questions. 1, what went well? 2, What could have gone better and why? Okay, that's probably 2.5 questions. So that's all for today, but we'll be back soon with the next in our series of presentations. The next one will be on risk communication, a really important aspect of risk management, so do look out for it. Thank you for listening.